And liberty is a god for the moderns because it promised so much and delivered so little.
Dzień dobry Państwu, nazywam się Mateusz Bliźniak, witamy w Opcji TV. Będziemy rozmawiać dzisiaj z Christopherem Ferrarą, prawnikiem, rzymskim katolikiem, autorem licznych książek, kolumnistą w czasopiśmie The Remnant oraz obrońcą życia poczętego. Christopher Ferrara jest założycielem organizacji American Catholic Lawyers Association, która występowała wielokrotnie w obronie życia poczętego oraz chrześcijan prześladowanych przez zwolenników aborcji. Dzisiaj będziemy rozmawiać o książce Christophera Ferrary Wolność, Bóg, który zawiódł. Poruszymy kilka wątków, które się pojawiły w książce. Rozmawiamy o współczesnej kondycji Kościoła, o synodzie amazońskim oraz o tajemnicach fatimskich, a zwłaszcza o zaginionej czwartej tajemnicy fatimskiej lub tak zwanej trzeciej B, która podobno nigdy nie ujrzała światła dziennego.
Okay, Mr. Ferrara, I have questions about your book. Why liberty failed and why should we be concerned?
Well, when I speak of liberty as a god that failed, I mean literally a god that was enshrined in the city of Rome. It's a statue dedicated to the goddess Liberty. There's a coin bearing the image of liberty. And liberty is a god for the moderns because it promised so much and delivered so little. It promised a new era of freedom such as man had never imagined before, the freedom from the supposed tyranny of kings and popes. And what we got instead was a relentless trend toward the centralization of political power in post-Christian nation states. What we got instead of the wars of Christendom, which were local affairs, were total war, world war, the bloodiest century in the history of the world. And not just because of weaponry, but because warfare itself became a national engagement under the totalizing authority of these new governments, which had been freed from all restraint and all attachment to the Catholic Church under the arrangement that had persisted for almost 15 centuries, when the gospel was the law of the land. The age of democratic revolution represented nothing other than the attempt to emancipate political society and the body politic from the authority of the Catholic Church, and with that came the loss of all socio-political restraints, as we now see in what is left of the moral order in the Western world. So liberty promised freedom, and instead we got subjection and the spread of license throughout society, just as the popes predicted before the Second Vatican Council.
Okay, in your book, you're writing about two kinds of states: the state of God and the state of liberty. And what's the difference between these states?
Sure. So, well, the answer to that question involves the answer to the question that Christ himself posed to his apostles. Who do you say that I am? And the answer to that question determines everything, really, for the life of men and societies. If Christ is who he says he is, God, the second person of the Holy Trinity, the Word incarnate, then the church he founded must guide not only individuals, but nations, which is why the divine commission is to make disciples of all nations. Now, our Lord wasn't speaking of nations in the modern sense of the nation state, but rather of peoples. All peoples were to be made disciples of Christ and followers of his church, in the collective as well as individually. So, the state based upon faith is a state that will have an organic link to the church, even if its form of government might be either monarchy, constitutional monarchy, democracy, or some variation of the three. So the essential relationship between church and state is, as Pope Leo says, and as I explore in the book, the same as the relation, analogously speaking, between the body and the soul. The church acts as the conscience of the state. It provides the moral soul of the state. And if, Leo warned, you cut that connection between the body of the state and its soul, you end up with a dead body politic. a body politic that is corrupted and decays relentlessly. And that's what we see today, because there's no longer any authority in the state higher than the organs of government themselves. The state is its own highest authority. It recognizes no authority above itself. Even though politicians piously invoke God's name as a blessing on their various secular undertakings, their unjust wars, and so forth, they don't really believe in God as the Lord of history, Christ being Lord of history, or as the one who guides the affairs of the collective in the state, as well as the lives of individuals. The French political philosopher Pierre Menand said that in modern political society, we're expected to be atheists under the God in whom we believe. It's a paradox, but it's true. We have to pretend that God does not exist at the level of the public, because the church is no longer recognized as having any authority over the state. Even if the state has its own autonomy within certain limitations, that connection has been lost. So we have the post-Catholic, post-Christian, post-moral, post-modern nation state. And now we see all manner of abominations being accepted, legalized, and even imposed upon people. And I note that, however, that Poland and Hungary, for example, are fighting against this tide. And God bless both countries for their efforts in that regard. They do show that this trend in history of the past 300 years is not some kind of Hegelian process that represents the will of God, but rather it's the collective result of human folly, and human will, aided by divine grace, can reverse it. So that's the problem we face. Will we remain a postmodern secular civilization headed toward what Pope Leo called final disaster? Or will the baptized, who still comprise the majority of the Western populations, awake like a sleeping giant and do something to roll back the gains of the moderns and end the tyranny of what Pope Benedict called the dictatorship of relativism? So that's the essential conflict before us today.
Yeah, that was my next question. Is there a way out of the state of liberty?
There are two ways out. The gradual way, which always involves the outworking of God's grace in history, acting through human agents. So at the time of the Arian crisis, it looked like all was lost. The vast majority of churchmen either professed the Arian heresy or were too afraid to confront it, even if they inwardly possessed the faith. Only the laity maintained the faith during that time. It took 60 years for the Arian heresy to be routed, and it finally required a decree of the Holy Roman Emperor operating with the church to bring it definitively to an end. And the same bishops who did nothing to stop it ended up returning to the open and fruitful practice of the faith, and the church was restored that way. That's the way that God works through human agents to restore the church in a time of crisis. The other way is the hard way. The hard way is a planetary catastrophe, some kind of chastisement of humanity, which is what we see in the vision of the Third Secret of Fatima that the Vatican published on June 26, 2000. In that vision, we see a devastated city filled with the dead. You see a pope barely escaping alive. He climbs to the top of a hill, and there he is executed by a band of soldiers who fire bullets and arrows at him. Someone recently suggested that the arrows could be rocket launchers. That's an interesting idea. And this pope is killed outside the devastated city, along with bishops, priests, and members of the laity. The vision also shows that Our Lady is repelling rays of destruction that are being hurled toward the earth by an avenging angel, but not before that devastation has occurred. So there's a mitigation of the catastrophe. And so in this way, the hard way, the whole planet is punished, and whoever is left behind picks up the pieces and restores Catholic social order. There's a novel, a science fiction novel, maybe you've heard of it, Canticle for Leibowitz, written by a Jewish convert who got the equivalent of the science fiction Pulitzer Prize for writing it. It's about a world that's destroyed, and a Jewish convert establishes a religious order and restores the Catholic faith throughout what remains of the world. That may be the scenario. I don't know, I'm not a prophet. But one thing we can be certain of is that there will be a social restoration, a great metanoia, before the world finally does end, before we see the Antichrist.
We don't have explanation of the lady of the third secret of Fatima.
Right, we don't. And that's crucial because the vision itself is rather enigmatic. What does it mean? When does it happen? Who is this Pope? How far into the future is it? Why is the Pope executed? Why is the city devastated? Was it a world war? Was an asteroid hit Rome? We don't know the answer because there is no text to explain it. And yet Our Lady explained the rest of the Fatima message, including the vision of hell, which was perfectly obvious, and yet she told the seers, you have seen hell, where the souls of poor sinners go. Now, the obvious lack of a text is shown. There are hundreds of facts, but one fact alone ought to be enough to indicate to people that something is missing. That the Vatican trotted out Cardinal Sodano. This is the same one who covered up the scandals of Father Maciel Delegado, to give it his interpretation of the vision. And according to him, this Pope being killed on a hill outside a ruined city is John Paul II not being killed in the not ruined city of Rome. It's ridiculous. But the fact that they had to use him to interpret it means two things. One, we needed interpretation, which Our Lady must have given us. She would not have left us without an interpretation. And number two, we don't have the interpretation because it's being suppressed.
What's the role of religion in both states, in the state of God and the state of liberty?
Well, in the confessional state, which you have called the state of religion, religion is tightly integrated into the life of the state. So, of course, there's the influence, the controlling influence of the faith on questions of morality, where the concerns of the church and the concerns of civil authorities overlap. So, in such a state, there's no divorce, there's certainly no abortion. Homosexuality, which is nothing but sodomy, is not legalized, much less condoned as a form of marriage. There's no sale of contraceptives. There's no sale of pornography. Holy days are also days when business isn't conducted. There are Sunday closing laws. Schools are parochial schools. There are no state schools. There is no civil marriage, which is an invention of the French revolutionaries. There is no civil registry of births. Births and deaths and marriages are the province of the church, which controls all of these phases of our life, as she should, because after all, we're born into the church when we are baptized, and the church has the care of souls. That's the confessional state. In the confessional state, you have sinners. You certainly have criminal activity. There are wars, very limited compared to the modern idea of war. There's no perfection, there's no paradise, but there is as much social peace and tranquility, the tranquility of order, which is the order of the soul, as can be had on this earth. And why is that? Because the body politic, which is the whole of the collective in a political society, is also the mystical body. People are united by baptism. They worship in the same way. They go to the same liturgy. There is a liturgical civilization. And that fabric of unity, which is a spiritual fabric that underlies civic order, was torn in the first instance by Martin Luther, when he divided Christianity into numerous confessions. And then those confessions founded their own perverted versions of the confessional state, which still had some notion that religion had a role in the life of the state. But more and more that disappeared. And with the age of democratic revolution, kings were overthrown. And then finally, in America, 1776, you had the first officially religiously neutral state. Now, a religiously neutral state is what we have today. And it isn't religiously neutral. It actually, by definition, is hostile to the true religion. He who is not with me is against me, said our Lord. The state which declares itself neutral with respect to Christ has actually adopted what one theologian has called an anti-theology of the state. it professes itself not to be Christian. Therefore, it becomes the enemy of Christian principles. In my book, I talk about how a movement of Protestants, mostly Presbyterians, in the mid to late 1800s, just after, actually it arose during and just after the Civil War, was warning America that the Constitution of the United States needed to be amended to recognize in its preamble, these are Protestants, believe it or not, the social kingship of Christ. It must say, the Constitution must say in its preamble, that the revealed will of Christ is the law of the land. And that amendment was submitted to the United States Congress. And President Lincoln at the time pronounced it interesting, never did anything with it. And Congress never voted upon it because it was shelved by a congressional committee. They issued a report saying we cannot submit this to Congress to begin the constitutional amendment process because the founders did not intend any such thing. They intended that anyone, a Mohammedan or an atheist, could serve in the national government. In other words, they intended to create the first notion, the first working model, rather, of a secular state. And these Christians in the 1860s, Presbyterians, warned that the result would be disaster. They said, if we don't do something about this now, all of the state constitutions in each of the individual states, which still recognize the role of religion, will be overcome by the national constitution. And one of them warned that our laws and institutions will sink to the level of that constitution. And politics in America, he said, will become a Christless, godless blank, which is what it is. But it's actually even worse than that now. It's an anti-Christian, anti-divine, positive agenda to destroy whatever is left of Christian morality. And that's what we're seeing today. We actually have a presidential candidate in the United States of America who's regarded as a serious contender for the office of the presidency, even though he married a man and lives in a perverted relationship that even the modern catechism of the Catholic Church describes as intrinsically disordered, involving acts that are acts of grave depravity, to quote the catechism of John Paul II. Yet Americans are now expected to accept this. And Pope Leo XIII, writing in 1888 in Libertas, his landmark encyclical, said that if you allow to exist in the state a condition in which error is allowed to propagate on the same footing as truth, error will ultimately prevail, and the truth will be persecuted. And that is exactly the outcome we now see in the United States and throughout the Western world. The only people who are persecuted are Christians. Muslims are not only tolerated, but coddled. Why? Because they are the enemies of Christ and his church. It's the old diabolical principle. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's why liberals who should be condemning everything Islam stands for, its subjugation of women, its brutal treatment of homosexuals by summary execution, throwing them off buildings and so forth. These things liberals would normally condemn, but they overlook them when it comes to Islam because they know what this is all about. The whole struggle for our civilization is about one thing and one thing only. Him, Christ, the Lord of history, who asked the question 2,000 years ago, whom do you say that I am? And they answer the question in the negative. You are not God. We do not recognize you. We rebel against you. And that rebellion is the foundation of our whole civilization today.
We have a really interesting thing in Germany, just around Poland. From the monetary perspective, it's really not worth to accept all the Muslims, accept all the immigrants, and it's really strange that the politics are going this way and going against all facts.
It is strange that Europe would seem to be embracing its own suicide by encouraging the mass immigration of what are basically the majority of the Muslim military-age males, who are causing immense problems now, as even Chancellor Merkel admits that there are actually no-go zones in Germany. She finally admitted that. So it does seem strange until you look at the underlying motivation. And as I said a few moments ago, the underlying motivation is simple. It's been going on for 300 years. It's a rebellion against Christ the King. The revolutionaries who overthrew altar and throne in the 18th and 19th century had one thing in mind, which was to overthrow the influence of the church, which means to overthrow the influence of Christ in terms of his social kingship. If the relationship between church and state, the one true church, and the state could be ended, then they could remake society according to their desires. And that's what the age of democratic revolution is all about. And that's what today's encouragement in Europe of mass Muslim migration is all about. And that's why there's so much opposition to the so-called populists and nationalists who exhibit maybe the last vestiges of militant Christianity when they say, enough, enough, we want to retain the Christian identity of Europe, just as Islamic nations want to retain their Islamic identities. But that's not permitted, you see, for Christian nations, because once again, it's all about destroying whatever is left of Christendom to finish off this process that began 300 years ago. The whole world said Pope Pius XII is being divided into two camps. He said this in 1951. Those who are for Christ and those who are against Christ. And he said that the outcome of this struggle will be either the salvation of the world by Christ or its dire destruction. Those are the only two alternatives. They always have been the only two alternatives. Society, as well as the individual, will find its salvation only in Christ. And when society kicks against the goad and rebels against Christ, society returns to its pagan past. Worse than the pagan past. Now we don't even have natural morality being defended at the level of public life. Instead, we have sodomy being defended as a right, and the mass murder of innocent children in the womb. In America, even at the moment they're being born. That presidential candidate I mentioned before, Pete Buttigieg, an apostate Catholic who defends, he has the devilish audacity to cite the Bible, the practice of partial birth abortion, calls his abominable relationship with another man a marriage, and no one is allowed to criticize this in America. And the irony is that we now have a president, Trump, an ex-playboy, a very checkered past, morally speaking, yet he represents the last plug in a dike that is about to be breached and pour evil all over the United States of America, drowning whatever is left of morality in this country. Trump alone stands there. It's incredible.
Yeah, he was only president on the March of Life.
Right, the only president to address it in person. And I don't know if he's undergoing a religious conversion. I know his wife's a Catholic. That's a little problematic because of his past. But then again, his marital situation might be rather easy to resolve. It may be that he's never actually been married to anyone, because his first marriage was to a divorcee, his second marriage was invalid for that reason. I don't know how he married Melania. It probably was not a Catholic ceremony. But if they wanted to be married in the church, it would be relatively simple, if you underwent this conversion, for him to become a Catholic. I'm not saying that's ever going to happen, but the situation in America is so bad that Trump is the last best hope for avoiding final disaster, which is why, by the way, all of the powers that be, not only in the United States, but throughout the global elites, are conspiring to destroy Trump. And maybe it's divine assistance in some measure that explains how this man has managed to survive endless investigations into every aspect of his life, something we have never seen in the history of the United States of America. It's as if the one world order, like some kind of mystical body of Satan, recognizes that there's this foreign element inside it, and its immune system, its devilish immune system, is trying to expel it in any way it can. Trump doesn't belong there. What's he doing here? He's spoiling all our plans. Hillary was supposed to win, and the gay flag would rise over America, and all opposition would be crushed, but it didn't happen. I have to tell you, it was a political miracle. The night of his election, we were watching these returns. We expected Hillary Clinton would win. We saw Trump beginning to win state after state, and my son and I dropped to our knees in front of the television screen and began praying the rosary, and he won the election. It was a miracle. Maybe it's a last chance that America's being given.
Let's talk about church worshipping of Pachamama idol in Vatican Gardens and all the events after that, and all the alarm it raised after some guy just dropped the idols to the river. So you decided with the other signers to protest against that in letter. So was there any result of that said letter?
Well, we didn't expect the result because, of course, Francis is not going to answer a letter written by some people who object to what he's doing. He won't even answer the dubia that were filed with him personally by 4 cardinals, 2 of whom have since died. So, no, we didn't expect a response, at least not an open response. Now, some have suggested, and I certainly credit the argument, that the rising resistance of the faithful, not just traditionalists anymore, but many so-called conservative Catholics all over the world, has caused this Pope to rethink his priorities, or at least strategize differently as to how to achieve them. So there may have been in the document Quiritis Amazonia some explicit permission for the ordination of men, and at least an opening to female deacons, but it may have been removed at the last minute, because you may recall there were press accounts that the draft that was circulating had explicit permissions for these things. But then when the document appeared, they were gone. So Francis may have calculated that this is not the time to do it, or perhaps it is not the way to do it. But be forewarned, because in the opening paragraphs of the document, he refers to the final document of the Synod. In this post-synodal apostolic exhortation, he refers to the final document of the Synod. And he says, I am officially presenting the final document. And I ask the faithful to study it and to apply it. Now, in the final document, there is a clear opening to the ordination of married men in the Amazon as a kind of second-class priest, because they obviously would not have 7 years in the seminary. They would just be elders living in tribes, and they would have many children, and they would be ordained in middle age, and even later perhaps, just to administer the sacraments. They would be like priestly utility players. That was in the final document, and he says to the world, apply it. So what may happen is that some local bishops' conference in one of the Amazon countries may start ordaining married men, elders, so-called elders as priests, and then they will issue guidelines, and Francis will say, oh, these are very good guidelines, and he will publish them in the AAS, which is the official chronicle of papal.
As it happened in the case of Amoris Laetitia.
Exactly the same method. He said he did not explicitly authorize Holy Communion for public adulterers during the Synod on the Family. He just hinted at it. Everyone knew that's what he wanted. But when the time came, he had the guidelines of the Buenos Aires bishops sent to him. Obviously, he requested this. He reviewed them and said, oh, yes, these are very good. In fact, they're so good that I will say that these guidelines are the authentic interpretation of Amoris Laetitia, my post-synodal apostolic exhortation after the Synod on the Family, and I will publish them as authentic magisterium. So now you have bishops in various places, Italy, Germany, and elsewhere, allowing people who are in second marriages, who are living in adultery, as John Paul II insisted, to receive Holy Communion, contradicting John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and 2,000 years of church teaching and discipline. That's how he did it. He may do the same thing with married priests and something like female deacons. Let's remember that he is reconvening the commission on female deacons, because word has it that the first commission didn't tell him what he wanted to hear. The first commission was either ambiguous, or I tend to believe came down against any historical evidence for the existence of a female diaconate. So he said during one of his press conferences, he would reconvene the commission and add new members until he gets the result he wants. And then we may find later on that the commission comes out with a different report, and that some local bishop somewhere starts ordaining something like a female deacon.
Do you think
Yeah, it may well happen. But then let's not forget the Holy Ghost can intervene at any time. So
I was ready to ask you if they will find some documents hidden under the stone. Yes, there are woman deacons. Go with it.
Yeah, I don't know what he expects to find from this commission because they've already done their research. In fact, there was a commission earlier that came to the same conclusion. That wasn't good enough. So they had this commission under Francis, and that wasn't good enough. So I guess he'll just keep convening commissions until he gets one that arrives at the result he prefers. That seems to me to be the plan. Now, of course, anything could happen to prevent that. Anything from an inspiration of the Holy Ghost, Francis changes his mind, to a political decision that he just can't do it because he'll lose all credibility, or it could be a comet hitting the Earth. Who knows? I'm not a prophet.
What is the direction of the church right now? Where we are going with that?
The church is heading to a total restoration. That's inevitable. Our Lady of Good Success, who appeared in Quito, Ecuador, said that at this time, when all seems lost, that will be the beginning of the Great Restoration. You can't destroy the church. You can make a mess of it, which is what Francis says. It's his motto, make a mess. You can make a mess of it throughout much of its human element for a time. You can cause a lot of chaos. And because God relies on human agents, his ministers, there could be a loss of souls. And the ministers responsible for that would be accountable for it. And we're all accountable, more or less, to the extent that we contribute through our own sins to the state of the church. But in the end, there will be a restoration. There has to be, because the church is a divinely founded institution. That doesn't mean we do nothing. No, we have to oppose the errors and do anything we can in our stations, according to our stations, to help bring that restoration about. For most of us, it's simply refusing to give up the traditional liturgy, the traditional catechetics, the traditional way of life, holding on to all the traditional observances, and just bringing children into the world. Over time, traditionalists will become the majority of Catholics if present trends continue. That's already the situation in France, where the majority of Catholics who attend Mass every Sunday are attending a Latin Mass. It's a matter of simple demographics over time. That's the long way. But there could be a more miraculous intervention. Our Lady did promise in the Message of Fatima that ultimately Russia will be consecrated to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. There will be a triumph of her Immaculate Heart, and that triumph has to be a social restoration. We can't have abortion, contraception, legalized sodomy, pornography, and all the rest of it in the midst of the triumph of the Immaculate Heart. So that's going to happen too. It may happen later on, it may happen sooner, we don't know. I'm not a prophet, we can't predict these things. Perhaps if we had the whole text of the third secret, she would give us a heavenly timeline for when that might happen. But in the end, there will be a restoration. We can have confidence in that. And in the meantime, we do what we can to keep the faith. And when the Pope is a wayward Pope, we've had more than one in church history, we stand up and we say so. Not in a brutal or uncharitable way, but certainly in a firm way and in a manly way if you happen to be a man. There's no room for being pusillanimous in the face of this threat to the faith. You have to stand up and say no in a vigorous and effective way as a defender of the faith. We were made soldiers of Christ at confirmation, and we have to act like them. And we look with great favor on nations like Poland and Hungary. You're leading the charge in Europe.
Yes, but we do have a tough fight, and right now, half of of people at my age are left the church right now, and it's growing. So there are less and less Catholics in the public life, in the social. You wrote a book about Fatima, about secrets of Fatima.
It's called The Secret Still Hidden. And since I'm an attorney, I took a very forensic approach, like I was in a courtroom trying to prove that something is missing. At first, I was skeptical. I didn't want to become a conspiracy theorist and jump right off with the claim that something was being hidden, even though it was obvious that that vision, standing alone, couldn't be the whole of the third secret. So I made a systematic investigation. It goes on for some 180, 200 pages. And the evidence for the suppression of a text, the soundtrack, as it were, of the film, which is The Vision, published in 2000, has been kept hidden in the Vatican. The most logical explanation for it is the Vatican authorities at the time, this would be back in 1960 when it was supposed to be revealed, persuaded themselves that this couldn't possibly be the words of the Virgin. There must be some notations of Sister Lucy, too scandalous for the faithful. It would cause them to lose hope and faith and would cause them to panic perhaps. So we'll just consider this to be some annotations. We'll keep that aside and never publish it. But ultimately they published The Vision. There's a massive evidence, I can't even begin to go into it here, for the existence of a second text. One telling piece is the interview of Sister Lucia by Father Schweigel, sent by Pius XII to interrogate Sister Lucia in the 1950s. And he said, I can't tell you anything about it except that it has two parts. One pertains to the Pope, okay, and the other pertains to events in the 20th century. So these two parts would correspond precisely. Actually, he said the other part pertains to the logical continuation, the second part, of the words, in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, etc. So you have two parts. One pertains to the Pope. One pertains to the continuation of the phrase, in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, etc., which Fatima scholars agree is the beginning of the third secret. So he reveals that we have a vision pertaining to the Pope. Remember, the vision shows the Pope who was being executed. And then we have words which follow, in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, etc. And that alone indicates there are two texts, the words of the Virgin and the vision that was published 20 years ago. So those two things go together, and that's the problem we have with understanding the vision. It must predict two things: a crisis in the church that goes along with a crisis that affects the entire planet. That's why the city is devastated. And another telling indication is that in 2010, when Cardinal Ratzinger was flying to Portugal for his own pilgrimage, Fatima, he pre-selected a question about the third secret to be asked of him by reporters. And the question was, in the vision, can we see something other than the events of the 20th century? And he said, yes, we can see something new. And what we see is that the worst threat to the church comes not from outside the church, but from sin within the church. We have seen this always, he said, but today we see it in a new and terrifying way, in a way that is really terrifying, to use his exact words, in modo veramente terrificante, in a new and really terrifying way, that the worst threat to the church comes from within. Now, the vision that was published in 2000 shows no internal threat to the church. See soldiers, external enemies, killing the Pope on top of a hill. There's not a single indication there of an internal threat. So when he says the vision reveals that the worst threat comes from within, he has to be looking at something that goes along with it, that shows where the internal threat is and how it comes to be that the Pope must escape for his life from a devastated city only to be assassinated. Otherwise, the whole thing makes no sense. There's got to be a missing piece.
I want to ask you one more thing about your book, The Grand Facade. Can you tell us about your book? I think you are mostly known for this book.
title was inspired by the understanding that everything that has been imposed upon the church since the Second Vatican Council, the new liturgy, the new dialogue, the new interreligious dialogue, the new ecumenism, the new springtime, the civilization of love, all of these novel ideas and practices, absolutely none of them has been imposed upon us as an obligation of the faith. It's a de facto imposition. You can take it or leave it. No one ever made it a law of the church that I have to go to the new Mass. I could always have recourse to the old Mass. Pope Benedict finally admitted this on July 7, 2007, in Summorum Pontificum. He said that the traditional Mass was never juridically abrogated. And in his letter to the bishops that accompanied Summorum Pontificum, he said it was in principle always permitted. I repeat, always permitted. That's the biggest part of the great facade, that the liturgy of old was banned by the Vatican. It never was. Ecumenism. We don't have to practice ecumenism. I don't have to go to joint prayer services with the members of other religions. I don't have to engage in interreligious dialogue. I don't have to believe in ecumenism. It's not a doctrine or dogma of the faith. We don't even know what it is, really. It's just a collection of assorted activities. I don't have to believe in the new springtime. I don't have to believe that there's going to be a civilization of love without the church at its head. I don't have to believe in any of this nonsense. So that's why it's a great facade. It's a facade of novelties. And what is behind the facade? The faith of old. You can go to the Latin Mass. You can read the old catechisms. You can read the Catechism of the Council of Trent. You can do all the old observances. You can do the old way of Lent. You can do everything the same way you did it before the Second Vatican Council, and there is not a single law or regulation of the church that forbids it. All we have since 1960 is a whole bunch of options and permissions, none of which we have to accept. So it's fakery. It's all fake. None of it is really a change in our religion. It's only an apparent change. Now, the apparent change seems very real because all of the authorities, at least most of them, 90% of them, have gone along with the changes. So the impression is created, a false impression, that we have a new religion now. It's more open, it's more forgiving of things that the church always considered intolerable. And basically the church has opened herself to the world has entered the church, and the church has become worldly. But that's not dogma or doctrine. It's just a blunder, a terrible prudential blunder that has gone on, like the Arian heresy, for more than half a century. It's a crisis in the church, and it consists of this facade of ruinous changes, really, none of which ever had to be embraced by anybody. That's the reason for the title of the book. And I go through this book step by step with the process by which these changes were foisted upon the faithful under the false appearance of a command that was never given and still has not been given to this day. And then I added about 170 pages in the second edition, which is the only one you should buy at this point, to cover the pontificate of Pope Bergoglio, which brings these follies, these ecclesiastical follies, these changes that should never have been attempted, to a whole new level. Now we have Holy Communion, the public adulterers. We have the worship of pagan deities being endorsed by Vatican authorities and brought into the Vatican itself. And so we've reached an intensification of all of these disastrous trends under this pontificate. It's like a patient who's at the point of fever that is the highest before the crisis ends. Maybe the fever will break now. We don't know. But the point of the book is to show that it's all a charade. None of it was real. The faith is still there. You just have to go to the places where it's still practiced. Basically, a traditional Mass community, where you see Catholics having large families, voting correctly in elections, not going along with the modern trends, and they are the hope of the future. And I have to say, this is becoming a youth movement now. Young people who still practice the faith want the traditional Mass and the traditional religion. So there's hope in the midst of all of this, but the book exposes what has been done to the church for what it is, a mammoth fraud upon the faithful. Like the Arian heresy, which was a fraud too, back in the 4th century.
Do you have any message to the people of the Poland?
Keep the faith and lead the charge to restore Christendom in Europe. It's on your shoulders because you are the most Catholic people left on the planet. Sorry to tell you that, but that's the truth.
That's worrying truth. Thank you, Mr. Ferrara. Have a good night and great Mass.